Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools podcast. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. And today we are talking about strengths-based instruction. And, I actually am thinking of a story from when I was a kid. I was in second grade, and I've always loved writing. I dabble in writing poetry, even as an adult, here and there, very rarely. But as a kid, I was definitely one of those kids who was like writing all of the poems all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was in second grade, we had this calendar of activities that we had to do. Like we had to choose a certain number of activities. I don't even know, but it was kind of nice. We had some autonomy in how we were choosing it.
Yeah.
Now, this was pre-ADHD diagnosis. And so I remember one of the prompts on there, it must have been wintertime, because the prompt was like something about writing a poem about mittens. And I wanted to do this. Yeah, I know. It was the 80s. What are you going to do? I don't know what the relevance was of it necessarily, but it was an activity, perhaps busy work, whatever. But it was about writing a poem about mittens. And I wanted to do this. And my teacher was like, she did not want me to do it.
Oh.
She was like, it's going to take you too long. You're not going to get done with it. You need to just choose something different. So then
You dug in?
Oh, absolutely. Of course I did.
Yeah.
Then I was like, well, I'm definitely doing this now, and I'm going to prove you wrong that it's going to take me a long time. And I did. And I wrote this poem. Actually, the way that I took it, though, is I wrote the poem about mittens, which was the name of a cat.
Ooh.
And I loved it. But also, it's like I remember this. I have this memory. But when I think about strengths-based instruction, first of all, that was an area of strength. It was something I was interested in. I liked doing that. But additionally, there are these little pieces that you can integrate into, depending on a kid's own style of neurodivergence. Every kid is different. But for me, like that sense of competition or that sense of novelty, like those were definitely things that would get me engaged and you could use as a tool, as a strengths-based support for areas that maybe perhaps weren't always as strong as other areas for me. I think sometimes strengths-based instruction often gets interpreted really on a very flat level. Like it's like, oh, well, it's interest-based.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more than that.
Yeah. It's funny because as you were talking about that, I was thinking that oftentimes when we talk about strength-based instruction, one of the things that comes up is how am I going to tailor this to everybody's interests, right? And it's not about tailoring it to everybody's interests. It's about giving people the opportunity to provide information, learn information in the ways that are really strong for them, right? And, I'm thinking about the fact that like sometimes it's about tapping into their interests as a way of engaging a student. I've taught so many different things using Legos, using cars, like using all of these kinds of things. For example, the other day I was working with a student and we wanted to work on budgeting. I was trying to help him work on budgeting. And so we did this entire activity of like looking through car sites to find what it would be to do a medium cost car, a low cost car. What are the benefits of the mileage and all of those kinds of things? It wasn't about the car. That was the thing that engaged that student, and they had a really strong knowledge of it. But it gave us the in to have the conversation about what does it look like to budget? What else do you need to consider? And so I just want to make sure that when we talk about strengths-based instruction, we're not saying we have to change everything for everybody. Think about what kids are really good at and be a little flexible. And I don't mean that we aren't flexible. I think we can think more flexibly about how do we impart information? How do we let them show us their information? And what are some interesting and unusual and unique ways to leverage the strengths of the students that we have in our classroom?
I think another thing to remember too is like when we don't use that flexibility, when we don't have that ability to adapt for what our kids need, there are times when students will look at something and they will just become paralyzed because if it doesn't integrate some of their strengths, they really struggle. The last thing I want to do is sit there and do something that is really, really hard for me all of the time. Sitting there and spinning my wheels, I am not going to get very far. And so when we think about even building skills that are more aligned with, say, for example, like social and emotional skills or executive functioning skills, kind of like you were talking about, if we build it within an area that is already a strength, you use that as the support for this. So an example that has been given to me specifically has been when I am building executive functioning skills for myself. It is easier for me to work on building executive functioning skills within the context of, say, my podcast, as opposed to like doing my taxes, right?
Yep.
That's already a strength. And so there's some tools there that I can then build on and feel successful, because I think sometimes if kids don't feel successful, they're never going to get to where we would like them to be.
The podcast is an interesting example to me because I think one of the other things that I don't always think about, and I have to remind myself, is that there are strengths that we don't think about that
Mm.
kids have. For example, we often think very academically when we're thinking about strengths. In when we're talking about neurodivergence, we're also thinking socially in a lot of ways, but there are also like practical skills that kids have that we don't always think about, right? Like for example, the skills of knowing how to get ready or and out the door, or the skills of knowing what to do during a fire drill, or like those really practical everyday skills, or a student who knows how to clean a scrape and put on a band-aid and things like that. Those are skills that we don't think about. So making sure that we understand that there's a whole gamut of strengths that may be outside of where we're looking is something that I want to remind myself of. And in reminding myself, I think I'm reminding other people as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to listen to your interview today with Kareem Neal. I feel like this is going to be really helpful for me as well as all of our listeners. When I reflect on my time as a student, I can see so many moments when my strengths were overlooked because the focus was on what I couldn't do. That experience followed me into my work as a counselor. I saw students who had so much to offer, but were constantly being measured against a really narrow definition of success. Their creativity and their problem solving abilities and their unique perspectives were often dismissed in favor of compliance and standardized benchmarks. Those experiences are a big part of what led Amanda and me to develop our online courses for educators. We want to equip teachers with the tools to see and nurture the strengths in every student, especially those who are neurodivergent. Our courses are designed to help educators shift their perspective from deficits to strengths and to build neurodiversity-affirming classrooms where all students can thrive. If you're an educator or school leader and you're looking for practical strategies that empower students and foster a positive learning environment, our online courses can help. You can complete them independently or as part of your school's professional development plan. Visit neurodiversityaffirmingschools.com or click the link in the show notes to learn more about our courses and how they can support your work.
Today, I'm speaking with Kareem Neal, an educator and advocate with a deep passion for fostering inclusion in schools. Kareem has spent over 25 years as a self-contained special education teacher in Phoenix. Beyond the classroom, he's a restorative justice trainer for the Phoenix Union High School District, where he's dedicated to creating stronger, more connected school communities, especially for students with learning differences and those in Black communities who often feel excluded. Kareem's impact has not gone unnoticed. He's an Arizona Teacher of the Year, a National Teachers Hall of Fame inductee, and serves on the boards of both the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. He's also an Understood Teacher Fellow and was awarded an honorary doctorate for his contributions to special education. Kareem, I am so glad you're here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I would love if you could start and give us your definition of what neurodiversity affirming means to you, because I know it means different things to different people.
For me, I think of it so often because I'm often trying to make my school and schools around the country. I go talking about this a lot actually.
Yeah.
But I wish that it was people just had the understanding that people thought differently. Therefore, it would essentially fix all of the biases that people have and the unwillingness to adapt their programming and their
Yeah.
curriculum. I write a lot of curriculum for world history, and I think it's just in my mind to automatically understand that all people think differently.
Right.
And so, it's not as deep as saying this kind of class is for this kind of student or this kind of, it shouldn't be about that. It is knowing that students think differently and making sure instruction fits that.
Yeah.
And I know, school systems are so big that I think they have a hard time with that.
Right.
So for me, it's that it's understanding that all of my students think differently also, even though they're all in my class because they learn around, maybe the same grade level reading or something.
I love that, especially because I know you come from a background where you've taught in self-contained classrooms as well.
Mhm.
And so what you're bringing is this perspective that can be expanded beyond your own classroom. And I think that's really important for people to hear because we so often think of special education and then general education, but it's just education.
It is. And sometimes I get frustrated in that, when people think about special education and kind of inclusion, it's like, oh, your kid can come and like sit in this class because they have a reading level that's higher and it's fine. But they never do that with like a gen ed kid in a gifted class, right? They're not thinking of education that way
Yeah.
until they start thinking about special education. And then it's like, oh, it's too big of a learning difference apparently. And so that's it. Like, what?
Yeah, I can imagine.
We kept that same energy. It's like, yeah, we understand there's gifted learners out there who are learning at a much quicker rate, maybe, than their gen ed peers, but we're not then saying, so something is wrong with their gen ed peers and we need to place them in certain settings
Yeah.
and not and make it very hard for them to join their peers somewhere. And so it's a really frustrating thing that somehow when it comes to special education, it is the considerations of the way people think is not really quite the same.
It's an interesting distinction too, and I know Emily talks about that a lot because she has a lot of experience in the gifted education world, and she talks about how we talk about gifted educators, but we don't talk about, we talk about them as if it's fine. There's no considerations that, I mean, there are digital considerations, but we don't think twice about saying gifted students the same way we would say like disabled students or that kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
And with gifted students, we are often looking at sort of like where are their strengths, where are their interests, and all of those kinds of things. And what I really want to talk to you about today is like, how do we look at all of our students from a strength based perspective? And what does strength based instruction look like? I mean, I know in my experience in the classroom, having been a teacher, oftentimes people will look at strength based and think, oh, you're tapping into the interests of the child. And I think that's only part of it. And I'd love for you to talk more about what you think are the other parts of it.
You nailed it when you talked about like, oh, with gifted, they think about the strengths of the students. And then with special education, it is like where all the gaps are. I that this is fine where it's you need an accommodation for something to access some curriculum. That makes perfect sense to me. But when it is not, which ways do these students excel? Which ways do these students learn that are good? So I do a thing that I call like class swapping. And I've talked about this around the country
Yeah.
because I invite gen ed students into my classrooms, but not to help my students. A lot of times,
Mm,
special ed classes, that is the vibe. It is like a couple gen ed students are in there and they're like helping students with work or helping them with fun projects or watching a movie with them or some crap like that. And so for my class, it is you come during academic time and see how my students learn and the strengths like my students do well with any group you put them in, right? It's not, they don't need to be with their best friend.
yeah.
They are fine. And my students do well with raising their hand 12 times, even if they missed the 11 questions before that, because they're pretty sure they know the 12th one. And those gen ed students do not. And so there's strengths that are definitely out there, particularly when you think about certain social emotional things, but also academic strengths, right? So I have some students who pick up history quickly because they really enjoy that subject. But that is, that's not their math and English class. So they certainly still need special ed services for that. But then to think, okay, if they are excelling in that history class, how do we find ways to incorporate history into their learning? So it is not just about, um, the student who I don't know is a quick reader. It is
Right.
different ways that a student is good. Even like I said, social emotional. If I have students who do well with helping their peers, then they are a person who a lot of people can learn from that skill. And I wish more people have that, right? If they're a student who does well with taking chances, like I said, trying to answer questions and things like that. I want other students to see that because that is a skill that everybody needs to help bring out their willingness to learn new topics and things like that. So there's so many ways to have people consider the strengths of students and how that could make for better teaching, better planning, and then a better experience for the students in your class. If I have a student who really enjoys working with their peers, I find ways to have more projects that are done in groups.
Mm,
It's so simple. So it's not that difficult to think of it once you get in the mindset of thinking, all of my students have strengths. How do I figure out a way to teach so that those strengths can come out sometimes, as opposed to teaching in the standard way of, that I read in a book somewhere that might then leave behind particularly students like mine, but any student who
yeah.
doesn't do well with an old school lecture style or a new school project based style. There's a lot of students who don't do well with that too. So I'm figuring out ways to make sure everybody gets a chance to show off.
I love that you say that students who, take risks and take chances, that that's a strength, because I think when we talk about strengths, we're often thinking of them from a very sort of narrow lens, right? And I think a lot of people think of it as what's the flip side of the deficit? Because when we do a lot of deficit based teaching, a lot of deficit based conversation when we're talking about students who need additional services. And I think we often look at like, what's the flip side of that so we can find that strength. But what you're talking about is like, there are strengths that we maybe aren't tapping into.
Mhm.
Can you talk to me about like what other kinds of strengths that like educators might not be thinking of?
It's funny. I have a list. I'll have to send it to you as well. So if you want to make sure you have it, that I've been making over time. And, it was standard things because like I said, I am inviting gen ed classes into my specialized. So it's standard things like, how is this class the same as yours? And how is this class different for yours? Right. Cause I also want them to understand like these are their peers, right? And they're
Right.
out here doing similar stuff as what you're doing. But, a lot of those things are, students in my class are much more likely to like celebrate the wins of their peers. So like when a student in my class raises their hand, misses 12 questions and gets number 13, it is like nice job. And also when they're missing problems, it is not like, some snickering, some laughing if they blurt something out that is kind of off topic or,
Hmm.
they thought they were answering a question, they were totally off. Everybody is feeling comfortable sharing.
Yeah.
That is something that you either have and you are not. Well, in my class, you're seeing like, oh, it's being cultivated by these students, right? And and working with everybody, right? My students are so comfortable with being like, okay, I am sitting in my desk mate and we are working together a lot. But then next week, I might have a new desk mate who I don't know and hang out with as much and I don't eat lunch with. And I'm super comfortable with them as well because we're, moving them into groups very often based on certain learning things. And that is also a skill that a lot of students don't have innately. Like in gen ed classes, you will often see people kind of hovering around the people they feel comfortable with.
I mean, it's such a strength to be able to be flexible and adaptable.
Mhm.
And, I think school systems aren't always built to be flexible and adaptable.
Mhm.
And so when we're in classrooms where that's celebrated, we're building resilient
Yes.
kids in ways that, I mean, I love to celebrate that. I mean, and I think it's not to be underestimated the fact that you are cultivating that in the classroom, right?
Yeah, and another thing that I talk about a lot is, in special education, most teachers, parents, teams worry a lot about like transitioning, right? It's like, oh, transitions are sometimes difficult.
Yeah.
Well, because of that, by the time a student is in high school and in my class, they do really well with transitions. And then you realize like their general education peers also struggle with transitioning, right? And so my students are willing to on the fly have a lesson be changed because that happens a lot in these classes
Yeah.
and it doesn't rattle them because we have been intentionally working on that kind of stuff. So so there's a lot of the skills that all students need that the students in my self-contained special education classroom have that really would be beneficial for the world to see like, oh, if you are doing instruction based on strengths of students, you will see a lot of what is amazing about education that you didn't think would happen just because of that.
Well, and that's neurodiversity affirming, right? Like what you're talking about is that everybody needs to learn these kinds of skills, and that when you see people excelling at them, it's something to be, really noted. And I think that's important. I think we need to move beyond the place where it's like, well, your strengths are you're a great reader, or your strengths are you're a good, math student, or your strengths are you're a visual spatial thinker. I think as we expand those kinds of thoughts about what a strength is,
Yes.
right? Like we're able to really look at learning and not just schooling, right?
And until I started doing this, I don't feel like a lot of general education students viewed my students as their peers when they clearly are their peers. They live in the same neighborhood, they're the same age, they're going to the same high school, and they love most of the same things, right? But until they came in and realized there was a lot that they could learn from my students, until that happens, it is very difficult for you to tell somebody who typically it's like, oh, there's a student sitting in the back with an aide in our classroom, who they're not keeping up with the reading or whatever without that person.
Yeah.
And so it's just, oh, we view them as somebody to feel bad for or to help. And then they come in and realize there's things that they need help with as well. A lot of those things my students have, right? And including, it's funny, including academic concepts like, so I do world history. So like right now we're doing like industrialization and we did Reformation before and all of that stuff. However, we often do things like, oh, the people are so cool to them, right? So like last session was about revolutions. And then it was like, we talked about a lot of the forefathers in the United States. And so Gen Ed students are in my class and it's like, okay, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Who did the Articles of the Confederation? My kids know those things, right? Most high school students no longer know them because they learned them when they were in like third grade or fourth grade or something and they forgot about them.
Right.
And they're sitting there watching a bunch of students who they typically thought of as, oh, there's someone to help that need to be helped to like, oh, wow, they know a lot of things I don't know. And that is, people need to see that. Like everyone knows something and learns in a way that would be beneficial to me. I got into special ed that way. I was hanging out with, I don't know if you knew my story, but I was at a Special Olympics event. And they called me over because of how tall I am. Everybody wanted to like see me.
Okay, so we can't see you. You're 6'7".
Right. And it was like, oh, come over. And I came over and hung out with the athletes. And it was their authenticity, which I didn't have because I was a college student and we were all trying to dress alike, look alike, be alike. Right. And there was like a bunch of folks who were right around my age who were not being that way. And I was like, that is so refreshing. I wish I could be more like that. And it was like that kind of thing. I'm like, I want Gen Ed students to have that opportunity because they won't if it is always about just like you said, the things we think of as reading levels and math comprehension, right? And next thing you know, it is we don't see all the great gifts that are happening from the students who are in special education classrooms.
Well, I did not know that story. I'm so glad that you told that story. That's so cool. I love
I was
that.
a chemical engineering major.
I did not know that. That's amazing. That's quite a switch.
I had to go to grad school because it was too. I was a junior. I was a second semester junior, so I couldn't change to special ed. And so I went to grad school for special education and worked at a school for kids with autism as a paraprofessional to pay. And I did my student teaching right before I finished grad school as well.
I'm so glad that you had that experience because you've been such a gift to the education field. Like, and I mean that sincerely. I'm not, you know me well enough to know that I'm not just saying it to you, right? Like, I think what you bring, this idea of class swapping, this idea of making sure that people understand that peers are peers no matter what, is so important. It's so important. I'm so glad you're doing that work. If you had one thing about strengths based and neurodiversity affirming together that you wanted educators to remember, what would it be?
I guess I would say because I think it could be so huge in the reshaping of the way we think of inclusion. Because if you started doing things in a strength based way, you wouldn't be thinking that students in special ed classes are so far behind general ed students. And so, I mean, I think that's the concept of it. It is, teachers out there, when you think about how quote unquote difficult a student is, ask yourself if you're thinking about their strengths and teaching in a way that would highlight it, because if you did, that possibly would change your mindset. And I know enough to know that if gen ed students around the country, gen ed teachers around the country started viewing special ed students differently, we could crack open inclusion by a lot more right now. I think some of the hesitation with inclusion comes from teachers. It is like, oh,
Yeah.
students are difficult or whatever. I think if you adopted these principles of strength-based learning, you would see that it is not about who's difficult to teach or whatever. It is finding ways to highlight the amazing things that all students could do. I think it would kind of broaden your mind to not think about a student kind of like their Lexile score or something like that.
Right, right.
I never think like that. I never get a student who seems to be a fast reader and a student who seems to be a slow reader. It's like, oh, what am I going to do with this slow reader? Never.
Yeah.
It's like, wonder what gifts they're going to have that I can pull out of them and see where they go from there.
I love that. I love it. I think it's like a perfect place to sort of land this conversation is, think about that student that you may be viewing as difficult and flip that on its head and start thinking about like what's fantastic about them that you haven't discovered yet. And I love that so much.
And see, you'll even see kind of progress in the academic stuff, which a lot of people are so hung up on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Of course, we're schools.
we're
But yeah.
teachers, but I mean, from my perspective, part of teaching is guiding, right? Like it's a lot of it is guiding. We can impart knowledge, but if we can't guide students to figure out how to be their best versions of themselves and how they learn, then maybe we're not doing what we set out to do, right? And that's probably a whole other conversation, but I just had to put that in there for a minute. Kareem, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So, Amanda, as we circle back on this conversation and think about the things that we really want folks to take away from our conversation, I think the first thing is just recognizing that strengths-based learning is more than just making kids feel good. It's really about finding a way to teach the student who is right there in front of you and recognizing that every student has a diverse set of strengths and struggles. And the more we can adapt and meet kids where they are, the better off they will be.
Yeah, and the second point I think builds on that a little bit too, is that, we talked a little bit about how strengths-based instruction is more than just interest-based instruction. And I think the conversation with Kareem really highlighted that for me, because as he talked about bringing all other kinds of classrooms together in his school, right? He talked about how all of the students come together and the students who are not with his students all day long, seeing how much they know, all of the things that they can do, all of the strengths that they have, just being able to understand that although interests can be a part of strengths, there are all of these different ways to look at strengths, and having students recognize them in each other really just builds an environment where we are able to realize that there are strengths that we can tap into, not just as teachers, but to have other students teach each other what they know is a huge part of strengths-based instruction as well.
All of this strengths-based instruction stuff aligns so closely when we're talking about like UDL types of principles.
Yeah.
It just ties in so closely. But what I come back to is the fact that, when you set up systems in your classroom that allow for those strengths to come forward, it's not just good for your neurodivergent learners, it is good for all of your learners. And it creates some adaptability in them as well. And how powerful is it for students to see their peers have those strengths come to the surface and go, wow, that's something that you're really good at. And, even just that valuing helps to create a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of contribution in our students, which is so important. If you don't feel connected to that school community, if you don't feel like you can be successful, you're not going to be able to meet all of those requirements and the things that, we get so caught up in schools with the standardized testing and all of these other things. Like none of that comes together if you don't have some of these other pieces in place.
It's a lot to think about, right? It's a lot to think about. It's a mindset shift, and it's one that I'm super excited to see people start putting into place.
And I will just mention, if you are looking for ways to pull in specific interest-based ideas, use AI. So here's just a quick example of a strengths-based support. So this is in my clinical practice that we did this. So we have a student who is fascinated. His monotropic interest is electricity and has a very difficult time engaging and talking about anything else because he's autistic, and that is the thing that is most interesting to him. And I am not his actual counselor. One of the other counselors is, but we were sitting there during our supervision and talking through all of these things. And she's like, I don't know how to get him engaged. I'm like, let's just see what ChatGPT has to say about this. We said, come up with some ideas that are related to some cognitive behavioral techniques or some strategies for executive functioning of how we can integrate the concept of electricity into all of these ideas. It gave us so many ideas. And if you really learn how to use AI effectively and craft those prompts and then give it feedback and say, well, I like this, but not this, you can come up with a ton of tools that can really help you hook those kids if that's really what you need to do. Or, for example, those kids who love Pokemon, and if you don't have any Pokemon knowledge, you know who does? ChatGPT knows all about all of the Pokemon things. So I just love finding ways to get kids engaged, and this is such an important tool that we can use in a lot of different ways.
So now we know one of Emily's strengths, and I will have to tap into that on a regular basis.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time.